all those maps you showed us, they could have a tendency to make us feel paralyzed. And you have been through a situation yourself where there is so much uncertainty, and listening to the sweep of your life and the intellectual curiosity that's driven you in your professional accomplishments and what you're trying to do here, it's sort of remarkable when I think about your roots as a child suffering through this illness. Can you give us that and tell us what you've drawn from that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sometimes sheepish about it because this work isn't about me, but I'm happy to share it to the extent that it's useful to people. And so I have an autoimmune. I have a bad immune system, and so it first manifested itself in a disease called ulcerative colitis when I was a teenager. And ulcerative colitis is no fun. It's painful and bad for your body. Basically, your colon doesn't work very well, and so food races through you. You lose weight, you lose blood. And this happened to me when I was 15 years old. And in every other way, I lived the most privileged life you could imagine. I lived in a nice town with loving parents in a good community, and so in a way, everything should have been going great. And all of a sudden, this one part of my body, the cells on the lining of my intestine, decided to go to war with each other. And that's what happens in an autoimmune disease. Your body starts attacking healthy cells. And I was debilitated. And so I lost a lot of weight. I couldn't go to school. And I just couldn't get over it. I couldn't get better. So years were going by. And at one point, my mother arranged for me to see a therapist. And I went in to see this guy. And he said, well, what brings you in here? I said, well, my mother brought me in. I said, well, why are you here? He said, well, and so I started telling him about my life. And essentially he said at some point, it sounds like your life is out of control. And I said, yeah, I just feel like I can't control my physical body. I certainly can't control anything. Like I'm both a teenager and I have no control over my body, and it's very hard to deal with. And he said, well, you're not totally out of control. Are there things you can control? And I said, well, some days all I can do is like get out of bed and take a shower. He said, then set that as your goal. Say to yourself, today I'm going to do that. And then if you have a better day, say, today I'm going to go to school for 2 hours. And if you have a better day, and each time you accomplish something that you set out to do, say, that was the most I could do. Those are my limits. But within those limits, I have some amount of control, some ability to function and to make my way in the world. And this was an important lesson to me because as I looked around at similarly privileged people, they all had dreams that they could do everything. There were no limits for them. And I realized at the age of 15, 16, I was always going to have limits, and those limits were going to be pretty non-negotiable. My body would rebel. My body would just say no. And so I had to learn to live within the confines of my body and what it could do. And learning that at an early age, especially in a culture where you're told to fulfill your dreams, to have the maximum dream you could have. Everyone could be president. By that time, it was obvious to me there's no way I could be president. I'd be sick all the time. Not that I aspired to be president, but I had to say there are things I can't do. And even when I was hired at Wellington, one of my first conversations with my boss was like, I just need you to understand, sometimes I'm going to be sick and I'm just not going to come to work, and I'll, be paid less when that happens, and that's okay. I just want you to know. And over time, each time I was offered more responsibility or asked to take on, I would say to the person offering it, you need to understand I'm unreliable. I'm physically unreliable. I will do the best I can. And then when I was I was in, my early 30s, I was diagnosed with a degenerative liver disease. And I was told I would need a transplant to survive. At some point, I would be on death's door, and with luck, I would get a transplant. And that provided clarity for me that, okay, I've got some number of years before I get really sick. And that too was clarifying. It sort of said, well, I've got limits. Let's figure out what I can do within those limits. And so this living within limits already made sense to me because of, in a formal way, because of my work as an engineer. I was a systems engineer. It's a closed system. Okay, my system had bounds that were a little bit different than other people's. But also my work on catastrophe, my being curious about Detroit made it clear to me that I wasn't immune from terrible things happening. Terrible things happen. And then spending time in Russia and spending time on the south side of Chicago, I had a constantly populated imagination for what really bad outcomes might look like. And this combination of knowing my limits, which gave me clarity about, I had to choose to do some things and not choose to do others. If I was going to do A, I couldn't always do B. And this was at a time when the culture of the United States, I mean, the culture of, 30% of all podcasts is how you can do everything. Life hacks, and you can, maximize. And I realized I just can't maximize. I have to choose what I do. I have to choose what's important. I have to embrace trade-offs. I came to think of compromise as a really good word. The second half of it is promise. This idea that, okay, let's just choose to live well within bounds, because the environment in which I was living, this temperate, lovely world with people I enjoy, like even a little bit of that is pretty great. And what I found disorienting and still find troublesome in American culture, in the culture of finance, in the culture of economics, is this obsession with maximization, and realizing that the framework of always maximizing, the framework that if you're leaving any money on the table, you're a failure. I had a conversation with the leaders of all of the banking divisions of one of the biggest banks in the world. And one of them said, but if we do what you're saying, we might leave some money on the table. And I said, yeah, you might leave some money on the table, and that would be okay. He said, but we can't ever leave any money on the table. And I said, well, then you're always all in. You're always exposing yourself to risk, and bad things will happen. And so I learned for myself that I had to be deliberate about what I chose to do and not do. My wife and I have made choices about how to constrain our lives in ways that leaves plenty of space. So why I'm comfortable probably with the probable futures framework is there's a range of outcomes. Within that range, there are really good ways to live. And this is one of the things I tell people about the future. We will live in a less good physical environment, and it's sad, but we could live a lot better in it. We could choose to live well in that space. And it's why I think that places like universities should be thinking about climate change intellectually, morally, philosophically, culturally, in education, in other things. Climate change is a challenge to civilization. It's not a technological problem, principally. And so I've been fortunate to have been taught lessons about restraint and compromise that wound up making my life incredibly fulfilling. And as you may know, I was eventually the recipient of a liver transplant, and my friend Carl Long gave me half of his liver, and without friends, I'd be dead. I could have maximized everything else, but without friends, I'd be dead. And the idea that there's no maximizing friendship, there's no maximizing of relationships, there's fostering of them, there's embracing them, there's cultivating them, there's enjoying them. And so my own body has been a helpful guide to living with limits, to understanding limits, to respecting them, and then to celebrating that you can live wonderfully within limits, that believing that life would be better if it were limitless, I think is folly. And our ancient ancestors, which I didn't think a lot about before, but before industrialization, people lived knowing that there were limits, and those limits were like the walls of your house. There was a kind of welcomeness to them. That's how the world is, and it's a great world. And I think this idea that we can somehow live beyond the limits of the planet still holds sway in Silicon Valley, in the principle of infinite growth in economics, in the idea that there will always be compounding in finance. The idea of the infinite, I don't think is very satisfying. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think humans actually have the capacity to live in the infinite. And if we could learn to live within the ranges of a really bountiful planet we've been given, we could live extraordinarily well. And so that's the hopeful side of probable futures, is we can populate that, not a sort of electric car paradise or some kind of dystopia, we can populate a more complicated world that's a little bit degraded, but still quite bountiful, and live extraordinarily well in that. And I don't want to overplay the comparison to my body, but it's pretty great to be alive if you live on those terms.
It's an incredible story, and it just so happens to be a perfect metaphor. I don't know whether everything was aligned to make this metaphor perfect, but I mean, it really is. And I have to say that I hope a lot of young people, one of the things I think I heard from your executive director at Probable Futures, Allison Smart, and other people who work with a lot of young people, this idea that a lot of young people who know the climate science are thinking about foregoing having children. And I think maybe if they hear your thoughts on living within limits, that may be a less attractive alternative, that they may indeed move forward and say, we can still create an awfully good world. We've still got a chance to preserve, let's say, an awful lot of what's great about this world if we keep those maps front and center and don't fail to imagine how bad it could get.
Yeah, I think that there's good reason to hope that wrestling with this problem, facing this problem, prompts us to be better people. I think about if you take the lesson of climate science the following way, it's that about the time when humans were really gaining an enormous amount of power in the late 20th century, scientists figured out that if we could just restrain our emissions of a couple of molecules, we could live in this comfortable climate forever. And it really is a couple of molecules, carbon dioxide and methane, principally. If we restrain ourselves, we can have this planet indefinitely on wonderful terms. And the rebellion by society was, no, we don't want those limits. We don't want to restrain ourselves. And the simple morality of that is pretty galling. I think young people are right to be angry, because it was really just restraint that was necessary to keep the stable climate. And now we're already in an unstable climate. And so maybe ending with this metaphor would be a useful one. I think of the climate as our house. And starting in 10,000 BCE, our ancestors were given a wonderful house, a stable, ideal, comfortable house. And they didn't really have to do anything to maintain it. Now, it happens to be the case that the people who lived for the next 9,000 years were quite respectful of the house. They lived on its terms. But starting about 1850, we started saying, you know what? We could make this place even better. We could make it more to our liking. And so we started pulling oil out of the ground. We started taking from the planet at a much faster pace. And when that happened, we started doing damage to the house. Now, before it became critical, climate scientists warned us, like, the house is getting a little troubled. So where we are now at a little over 1 degree of warming, and where we'll be at 1.5, we will still live in a great house, but it will need maintenance. We will need to commit to maintaining the house. And so to those young people, I say, let's figure out how to keep the house the way it is and maintain it. And many of those young people will spend their lives working on the house. And housework, this maintaining of the climate, can be very good work, can be work that actually anchors us to the land in many good ways. But if we keep wrecking the house, if we keep undermining the foundation and the roof, then most work will be maintaining the house. That will be the main thing, is maintaining the house. Right. And if you go far enough, then you wind up homeless. And in that homeless world, that world where we're all nomads again, but at a scale and with an unprecedented scale and in a depleted world, it will be much harder. That is a world to avoid at all costs. That is a world where it's hard to convey to a young people, you could live well in that world. But the worlds that are now and proximate, the worlds we can live in, we just live more aware of our physical surroundings. And we'd live more aware of our relationships with each other. That sounds like a pretty good idea anyway. Living more in tune with nature and living more in tune with each other sound like the same kinds of things people have learned in the last 2 years they would like more of in their lives. And so the climate is pushing us towards our better instincts anyway, if we can listen to it.